Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make 3 different landscapes using snowy textures. In my last video, I showed you 3 different ways to make snowy textures without using white paint, and today we are going to use those same textured backgrounds to paint something in them and create a full landscape. The first one looked very foggy and misty to me, so I thought it would be the perfect landscape background for a cabin that maybe had smoke coming out of the chimney, just very airy and light. This is the background that we used making just clean water, tapping it into the sky. The link to the video where I describe the process of creating these textured backgrounds is in my description below. Remember that with watercolor, you're going to start with your lightest colors and slowly increase your contrast with the shadows. So paint your little cabin, and then as everything dries, you can add darker areas for shadow and contrast and details. The main thing you want to do is keep all of the white of your paper for the snowy bits. So like the snow on the top of the cabin, the little bit of snow that would be on top of the chimney, and the snow that is kind of covering around the edges of the cabin, you're going to leave a little bit bumpy so that it looks like the cabin's sitting in the snow. To give the snow a little bit of color and highlight and some texture, I like to use cerulean or another really light blue that's very watered down and kind of do a side swiping stroke so that I can get the texture of the paper and it kind of looks like the texture of snow, but we're able to color it with a color because snow technically isn't completely white, it's reflecting the colors around it. So we perceive it as white. We're going to leave as much white as we can, but we can use other colors in the snow to help give it that snowy look. Something I like to do also is to create trees behind where the snow is on the roof. So this really helps define the edge of the roof. I can almost outline it in this really icy blue color and then create trees coming off of that so that we are defining the snow without painting the snow. So it's a form of negative painting by painting the trees around the top of that roof so that we can define where the snow is on that roof. I also removed some of the paint that was right above the chimney so that it looked like there was more smoky texture coming out of the chimney, and then I'm going to define that feature by painting trees directly on either side of where I want that smoke detail to be, and then it will look a little bit more like some really soft smoke is coming out of the chimney and creating some of this effect that's up in our sky. I like to paint the trees very softly at first, using a lot of water so that everything is very blended out and not very defined, so that it looks like the trees are farther back. And then as the paint starts to dry and it's a little bit more wet on damp, I can add darker trees in the front, give it a little bit more contrast, and that creates a lot of depth. So it looks like we have some trees that are farther away, some more middle ground trees, and then some trees that are a lot closer to the cabin. I'm always looking for a way to create movement in my pieces, and so a path from the cabin out into the middle of the landscape is a great way to do that. Just make sure that it's really, really thin the closer it gets to the cabin because that's the farthest point away from us. And then as the path comes closer to the edge of the paper, it gets a little bit wider so that you have the right perspective. As everything begins to dry, we can add more details and contrast and shadows that aren't as blended out and have crisper lines. So doors and windows, details on the house, shadows on the house, shadows in the snow as well. Another great way to add movement, especially when you're painting a little house or a barn, is to add a fence. Just make sure that the fence has the same perspective laws as that road. Everything that is farther away from you is smaller and closer together. And then as it gets closer to you and closer to the edge of the paper, the details get bigger and they get a little bit farther apart, those posts. Don't forget to add shadows to your posts that are following the same shadow rules you have applied to the rest of your landscape painting. So since I have shadows on the right side of my barn, we're going to have shadows on the right side of my fence posts. And then as everything starts to dry, we can add more contrast and shadows to the actual posts of the fence so that we have all different colors and layers within every object that we paint. The paints that I'm using today are from Letter Sparrow. It's the split primary palette. I know she has a wait list on her website. I love this palette. It is perfect for mixing, and the brush that I'm using today is a long round size 4. It's perfect for painting really tiny landscapes and getting those really beautiful details while also still being able to use the body of the brush for bigger sweeping parts. All right, so let's move on to landscape number 2. In this landscape, we used salt to create this beautiful snowy texture. When I saw the way that the white parts of the paper were patterned, it looked very much like trees to me, and so I really wanted to do a main snowy tree and some trees kind of in the distance. So part of this whole series is we are not using any white paint to create any of our snowy effects. So we're going to start again by using a very icy blue. I'm using cerulean to create these background trees that are a little bit farther in the distance. When you're painting trees that are farther away, you don't have to make them very detailed, and you definitely don't want to make them very dark. So I'm using a lot of water. This is a very watery wash of this light cerulean blue, and I am just kind of creating the idea of shapes of trees in the background. I did want to leave the center kind of open and not put any blue because this is where I'm going to put the tree that has the snow on it. But because I'm using the white of the paper, I really wanted to make sure to circle around where my white spots on the tree were so that I didn't accidentally paint inside them. So I used a pencil to sketch out the snowy shapes that were going to be on the tree, and then we're going to use negative painting technique by painting around them to create them. So I'm going to be using green to paint around these snowy shapes. So it's a little bit tricky because you're trying to create some texture of the tree, but if it's too textured around where your snowy circle shapes are, it's not going to actually define the snowy blobs that are on the tree. So we do want to kind of outline without having too much texture around the shapes that you've outlined, and then give a little bit of texture, a little bit of wispiness as you come away from it, and then as you get to another shape, kind of outlining that again. So we can create a lot of shape with the shadows and the details later, but the first wash of color around the shapes is really defining them, so don't worry too much about the tree texture at that point. Then we can mix in some indigo with our green and start adding a shadowy green color underneath the shape. So think about shadows in the tree that would be under where the snow blobs are on the tree. So we're going to use some light blue again for shadows on the snow where the tree is casting a shadow, but we're also going to be using some light blue on the snowy blobs. So just a little bit of a light blue shadow right where the snow is touching the tree gives a lot of depth and texture, and we're going to continue to add shadow as everything starts to dry. Now that the tree has mostly dried, this is where we're going to be adding a lot of the shadow and texture to the tree. Because we have already defined the snow blobs that are sitting on our tree, we can use the shadow color, which is just a little bit of indigo mixed into my sap green color that I've mixed together, and we are doing little short strokes in areas where there would be shadow, where we need a little bit more texture, and we don't have to worry about defining the snowy shapes. Something that you'll notice though is we do need to define the snowy shapes on the outside of the tree. They kind of blend too much into the background because the background is still pretty white of the paper. And so we're going to start painting some more of those blue icy trees right around the back of this main tree. It's kind of what we did for the cabin for the first painting, is we can outline and define the snowy blob on the outside of the tree in the blue, and then bring that up and make it a tree shape, but then we have completely defined that edge. I'm using indigo to make the shadow where the snow and the tree are meeting just a little bit darker. And then we're just going to continue to add details and shadow as everything is drying and continue to layer it on until we like the end result. Okay, let's move on to the third landscape. This landscape is the one where we used saran wrap for the texture in the sky. And I'm really obsessed with the idea of creating negative trees. So instead of painting a tree, we're painting around a tree to create it. So I really wanted to create a snowy, white, fluffy looking tree with lots of brown, dead twigs and branches around it. So I'm creating the shape of the tree by using a blue color to create the jagged edge and then bringing that color up, sweeping it up into the sky. And I just really love this technique because it is a way to maintain the white or light color of the paper and have that be the color of your trees. And it applies to so many other kinds of landscapes, not just snowy landscapes. I recently did a fall landscape where I did this same kind of idea with the yellow or brightest part of my tree, and I painted the sky around it to create the jagged, rough edge of the lighter, brighter highlight parts of the tree. So there are a lot of different applications for this technique. I'm also going to let it dry completely, that blue that's behind there, and I'm going to add a second darker layer behind these lighter trees. But for now, I kind of painted inside the trees with some lighter blue just to give some texture, some movement inside the trees, and some really magenta, rusty brown color to start laying the foundation of shadows and dirt and where some of our twigs and branches are going to be. Now that it has dried behind those lighter trees, we can do a darker layer. So you really could do this negative painting technique over and over again until you had as many layers of trees as you wanted, just continuously getting darker and blending your color that you're using up into the sky. So I'm using a darker, more indigo blue to create the next kind of group and layer of trees behind our first layer of trees, and then just using water to blend that darker color up into our kind of snowy textured sky from the saran wrap. Now that the insides of the trees are dry, we can start placing our sticks and stems to define the tree. Don't completely make them connected. We want it to look like there might be some areas where some of these white, snowy parts of the tree are intersecting between the branches. So I like to leave them a little bit loose and disconnected to give the idea that there are branches peeking out. Make sure when you're painting your sticks and your stems that you're not doing them completely straight. Some of them can be jagged and disconnected, but also, even if you're not painting a tree where there could be some leaves that are kind of in the way of some of those disconnected branches, there is such a thing called implied lines where your brain connects the lines. So sometimes if we have too many lines, everything's too connected, it actually doesn't look right in a painting. So if we disconnect some of our lines just a little bit, our brain fills in the gaps, but it looks so aesthetically pleasing. So you can see here, even though I'm not painting a tree with leaves, it's kind of more of like a dead branch situation over in the corner. It looks all connected, even though there's obviously some spots that are kind of floating in the air, but our brain connects them and it looks really aesthetically pleasing instead of having to make every single mark and every single line that we feel like needs to be on a branch. We're going to add a little bit of cerulean blue for some of those highlights and textures on the snow again. And it's just such a great way to make some of the snow pop, even though we're leaving most of the white of the paper for the actual snow. Now that the branches have completely dried, we can go in with a slightly darker brown color to just really increase a tiny bit of contrast. So it's not all over the place, a little bit goes a long way, just enough to give a difference between some of the other areas. Landscape number 3 is finished, but I want to touch up a couple of things on the other two paintings before we're completely done. First, I just wanted to add a little bit of contrast with that same brown we were just using at the end of landscape number 3. So add a little bit more contrast to the shadows on the fence posts, a little bit of sticks and dirt into the landscape just to give another color besides that icy blue. We're also going to increase some of the shadows on the barn, and then we're going to call it done. And the only thing I wanted to change about landscape number 2 is we really needed to erase some of those pencil lines. And once we do that and kind of use the eraser to scrub at those white spots, it really brightens that snow up a lot. And I think everything looks perfect now. Thank you so much for being here today while we took those 3 snowy textures and actually turned them into full landscapes. I hope you learned a lot, and I can't wait to see you in my next video. Bye.